Welcome to Planet People Mining Season 2. I'm your host, Allison Koppel. Here we present the stories of trailblazers at the crossroads of mining, sustainability, and communities. Hear what motivates top professionals in this field of impactful work. Accompany them as they describe their challenges and explore the issues they tackle. And for our Spanish-speaking audience, busca Planet People Mining en español. Unscrambling eggs to improve government, community, company relationships with Todd Clewett. Today I speak with Todd Clewett, global external relations expert. Building from his career in the Australian government, he worked for an NGO in Papua New Guinea, was country manager for First Quantum in Panama, country risk advisor for Rio Tinto in Mongolia, and lead for government and sustainability for Fortescue in Washington, D.C., as well as external relations lead for Newmont. We speak about how in the current global fight for critical minerals, the winner controls tomorrow, and how this increased macro pressure will complicate even more company, government, community relations. Todd holds a Bachelor of Arts in Economy and Government from the University of Sydney, a Master's in Urban and Regional Planning also from the University of Sydney, and a Master's in Public Administration from Harvard University. Todd, it is so good to have you on the podcast. Let's get started to just introduce yourself beyond what I shared in the bio. What are a few major life and work milestones?
Well, thanks for having me, Alison. It's good to be here and good to be chatting with you. I think if I sort of think about career milestones, my sort of career, can be split into two. The first half was working in governments in Australia in various roles. And then in about 2005, I moved into working in mining, and I'd taken a job almost sort of in a big sort of fork in the road type career move. And I'd taken a job as a senior advisor to an entity called PNG SDP in Papua New Guinea, which was sort of like an NGO created by BHP when they exited the Ok mine after contaminating the Ok River. And so I went to Papua New Guinea and lived in Papua New Guinea for a couple of years and ended up being the COO of the foundation there, which was huge, which had, I think, $1.5 billion in the foundation and was spending around about $80 million a year for the benefit of the communities affected by the contamination of the river. And we're bigger than the World Bank in terms of the spend each year. And so that was sort of the real shift away from a traditional pathway in government in Australia that I'd led until that point. And from then, that was about 2008. I moved to Papua New Guinea. From then to now, I've been largely working in mining, or at least for mining companies. Worked in Mongolia for Rio Tinto and Oyu Tolgoi. Worked for 5 or 6 years in Panama as the country manager for Cobre Panama for First Quantum. Then worked for Fortescue as running their external relations, sustainability, communities, environment space, largely for their green energy work, but then ultimately sort of bleeding over into some of their mining stuff as well. And then in the past 12 months, worked for Newmont as head of external relations. So there was a big fork in the road in about 2008. And since then, I've worked all around the place in both in sort of localized roles and head office roles in that mixture of government relations, community relations, communications, and media. So that's the potted history, I suppose.
You have such an interesting background in terms of geography and even how you packaged up this broad exposure. I mean, government relations, community relations, communications, package it up as external relations. What would be your ideal technical space? Or is it really this combination of everything at once?
For me, it's a bit of the latter. It's a combination of everything at once. And it's sort of like what I just, what's described often as above the ground or outside the mine gate risk. to mines. And in a role, you've got direct responsibility for that sort of set of functions, or if they're shared among people, they're so closely interrelated, whether that be the media, the governments, the local communities, particularly the external environment issues. These things are integrated and interwoven. So you end up sort of working with the folks who are responsible for those things wherever you are. But my take on it is, as a professional in this space, you've got to understand what I call like the ecosystem of power or the ecosystems of influence in the places in which you operate. And all of those things affect decisions and pathways for mining companies, for communities, for everybody affected by mining. So I think they're all interrelated. Whether you're responsible for them in your role or not, you've got to work really closely with the folks who are responsible for them.
Now, do you find, and of course, you've had such a diverse set of experiences, but I like how you put that, this ecosystem of influence that you have to understand and operate in and manage. Do you find that your role in this is easily understood by your colleagues?
So increasingly, yes. And I think that's part of the evolution of mining companies in the past sort of decade and a half. And so I think people understand now the importance or how much influence external factors can play in the material decisions that affect the company and that affect the mine. Now, so people understand, for example, on the government relations side, that understanding the government is important. Where there is a misunderstanding is, I suppose, when you get into into depths. So oftentimes on the community side, my observation is that there's technical expertise in social performance and community engagement that can be undervalued at the executive level. And it's too often just seen as, oh, just keeping people happy who live near the mine. And I think that's changing over time. And equally on the government relations side, there's a sort of an old school view that this is about pleasing politicians when it's not, when it's really about engaging with the folks who've got material influence or decision making that affects the mine and shaping the way they see the world in ways that are good for the long-term prosperity of the company, the mine, the community. So I think people get it at a basic level that these outside influences really can materially affect the mine and the company. But when you get a couple of layers deep, there's not a sophisticated understanding of how to engage and how to do what's required to sort of be successful in the long run. But I think that's changing. I think companies are getting more sophisticated about this world and understanding how to integrate it better into the rest of the disciplines that mining has.
That's where I find it's really interesting is that integration into other disciplines.
Yeah,
And already the way that you even described the integration of the government relations and the community relations and other actors along this ecosystem. I like how you put that together in an ecosystem. That's not even always well understood in companies. I've seen too many companies operate in silos that way and not
yeah.
realize government itself interacts in this ecosystem with communities and they are only there because of the communities, and sort of really understand how one influences the other and vice versa, and how your presence in that impacts that.
That's
I
right. And you've
very
got to have a realistic sort of understanding of exactly what you said, how your presence influences this ecosystem. And it's got to be a realistic understanding of that. And this sort of idea that you're the mind and you're sort of the big, powerful person in the place is just not true. But you do and you should have influence in that ecosystem. I remember one of the big lessons I got when I first moved to Panama was that we were in construction of a mine. It's a huge mine there, and I think there were probably 6,000 or 7,000 people working at the mines in a really isolated part of Panama. And there was an external trade union that wanted to take control of the unionized members at the mine site, and they've got a bit of a reputation in Panama. And they broke into the mine. Bear in mind, we're sort of 2 hours away from the nearest police station. They broke into the mine, they beat a few people up, there was a lot of vandalism at the site. It was terrifying for the workers at the site, the local communities. And I remember calling the Minister for Commerce and I said, look, these guys have broken in, they're committing crimes, we need the police here and we need them now. And then he calmly told me, he said, Todd, you need to understand that this isn't Perth, this is Panama, and this is your problem. And you need to find a way to fix this. And what I didn't know was the history of these guys in Panama, which was if the police had have gone up and confronted them in remote Panama, the history of their organization is that that dispute then spills into Panama City the next day and stops the whole city and stops the whole country effectively from operating. The government didn't want to buy that fight. The community didn't want to buy a fight with these guys because they were scared of them. And so for me, there was this sort of light bulb moment where it was like, oh, the government don't have control in these circumstances, nor does the local community. There's an external force in a country where the powers that I've taken for granted, the powers of enforcing the law, are very strong. So you then have to sort of recalibrate and think about how you navigate these forces at play when the traditional notions you've got of how you solve these problems can't be applied. And I think it goes back to the point of understanding the ecosystem of influence in a place and then being really intellectually curious about what's different about this place than the last place I was at or the places I know and I'm comfortable with. Because one of the cool bits about mining is it operates in wildly different places. And folks in my sort of profession and mine and yours, Alison, you've got to be able to sufficiently curious and adapt and understand what's different. And I think that's one of the cool things about it, but it's one of the obligations also of the work.
I'm so fascinated by this example because I think you described a situation where there's a company who actually has you in place, someone who has a career thinking about these issues, and it demonstrates how complex they are. And not only are you curious, but you have experience and frameworks to analyze these situations, and they're complex. So, even so, in this situation, you realize there was one step further. I was in a mining investment conference last year
Mm-hmm.
and engaging a number of heads of small exploration projects and companies and a number of investors as well. And curious, honestly, to understand what they are doing to understand the socio-political, not even just risks, but just the context in which they operate. Honestly, I was not surprised because I've been in the industry for almost 20 years, but it confirmed the unfortunate reality that I see is that most people, at least in their answers to me, were not able to articulate that they even studied at all in a curious, structured way the socio political context in which they operate. But they were very comfortable if they were a project proponent showing me a deck, because I don't know, you get into conversation and pretty quickly they show you a very fancy PowerPoint presentation
Yeah.
of a, and no disrespect to our geologist friends who are watching, but very in-depth geology pictures, but no understanding of what's above ground. Like what you said, something around what is outside the fence and the above ground, just context that
Yeah.
they are asking tens of millions of dollars of investment for.
Yeah.
And it's just amazing to me how they are not asking these questions, because when you even start to do the actual work and put someone like yourself in place who is experienced in this work, because the companies recognize to get this done, we're going to need someone whose only job is to look at these issues. It's even complex for the senior practitioners. So if you're just going to have
Yeah.
a company that's going to ignore completely the practice, wow.
Well, I think it's like a structural challenge for mining, right? Where there's sort of small, medium sized miners who see their business as either discovering a deposit or getting it to a particular point in time. So they just want to get it so they've got the deposit, they've got some type of right to develop, and then they'll sell it to a bigger company who's got more capability. But oftentimes in that sort of the time between, exploration to getting an approval to move forward with a mine, a whole heap of commitments have been made to local communities, to governments, to people who are part of that sort of ecosystem that have consequences for the folks who end up needing to build the mine. Now, typically, the folks building particularly big mines have got sophisticated systems and skilled people in place, but it's really common that what you've got is a set of incentives for the folks at the early stage of development that are just incentivized to get the thing past a particular, gate. I've been in examples and, really big mines that were started by an entrepreneurial guy telling the local communities they're all going to be millionaires. And then when you actually get into the nuts and bolts of what's going to happen, what the benefits could be, they all feel desperately disappointed. And you've broken the sort of trust of the community before you've even started. So for as long as the mining industry's got that structure where a lot of the early stage development's done by smaller companies without these sort of skill sets in place, and also without incentives to look for the longer term success, then you're going to get these problems. And the folks in, the social performance communities world start the job unscrambling eggs. And that's tough. So I think that's sort of like a structural challenge for the industry, because you don't see a hell of a lot of the big companies going all the way from early stage exploration, following it all the way through to operating a big site.
Is that an Australian term, unscrambling eggs? Because I love it. You start the job. I've never heard, but it's so true. You start the job. I've been in that role where I've started the job unscrambling eggs because it's all mixed together already. And I think it's a brilliant image because it's kind of, yeah, you eventually can get to a place. I mean, if we're going to use the analogy where it looks, you separated the yellow from the white a bit, but you're never really going to get it. It's because once that trust is broken,
Oh,
once
yeah.
that relationship is soured, because, well, I didn't wake up and become a millionaire. And what's interesting to me, although uplifting, is that there are a good number of investors who are asking these questions. And
Yeah.
then I do see it more and more. And I think that is a really key lever of change, is that when the next investor on the chain, like you said, there's an initial entrepreneur or small group who has this idea of a project, and then their goal is to sell it to the next investor. Hopefully that investor starts asking the questions because they realize, wait,
Yeah.
I actually have to know this to know if my investment's going to be successful. And when
Totally.
that question starts getting asked upstream, then the person before starts to realize, wait, I should actually put these processes in place, understand the
That's right.
context, and do this to get a better sales price.
Yeah, that's right. And it's not just the mining companies, it's the big investors who invest in commodities or the assets that they're looking for. So those guys do take a very serious approach to this type of thing. And the more that they can push those incentives down the line, as you say, so that the early stage guys say, well, there'll be greater value for what I'm selling if I can demonstrate the community has a healthy and well balanced understanding of what could take place here, what the trade-offs and how it might proceed. If you get, not just the local communities, the government interface, the media, etc., as everybody to the extent that you can, that they've got a well-balanced understanding of the realities. And if that is in fact valued in the transactions at that point, that would be a huge plus for the industry, would be my take.
Absolutely. So, switching gears a bit, what was the moment or moments, and you started to share about your earlier career, when you realized that this is your career path?
When I was working in Mongolia, the building, I was there at the sort of mid stages of building the Oyu Tolgoi mine. And I remember being in the local hospital and we were sort of touting the benefits of the mine to the local doctor who was also the surgeon. And she said, well, regardless of what you say to me right now, and then she points out the window, here's a power line going from the mine to wherever, getting power, huge amounts of power to the mine site. We've been operating here without power and with intermittent power, because it's in rural Mongolia, forever. And for as long as that power bypasses this hospital and we can't do operations, or people, power goes out when the operations happening because they're using batteries. Until there's certain absolute supply of power to this little operating village, I can't support you, and you won't get the support of the local people either. So that was sort of a signal moment. It was like, and it was embarrassing, right? Because I'm there sort of saying, oh, all the benefits the mine will bring. And the mine had already brought power to the mine, but the most basic function of providing healthcare to that local community was bypassed in the discussion. So that was sort of one. It was like, oh, I've got a role here. This is important. On the flip side, when I was in Panama, we were involved, and it was a long, slow process of enabling power to get to the local community called Coclacito, which was about 20 kilometres from the mine. And we got the local, Coclacito was provided with electricity when I was there. And it just changed the world of the folks who lived there. So up until that time, they're relying on diesel generators. The opportunity for schooling for their kids was limited to books, which were all out of date. And then, you get electricity that was delivered by the mine to the town. And it just changes the whole pathway of opportunity for the whole community. And you see it, you sort of go into town at night, there's lights on, there's kids in front of a computer, they're learning, and it's like, that's why you're here. That's why you do it. For me, at least, that's sort of one of the big light bulb moments. Whereas, like, yeah, that's why I'm here. That's why this makes sense. Like, professionally, I can make it make sense at a macro level. The world needs the materials that we mine for the benefit of industries and populations, copper in particular, which I worked a lot in. That goes to sort of powering the world, building cities, etc. So at a macro level, you can make sense of it, but it's really at the micro level where you see local communities getting benefit from it. There's like, yeah, that's worth my time. That's why I dragged my family down to Panama for 5 years. Here's the sort of the benefits of the job that I do. But it's really at the individual level where you see benefits occurring and change and opportunities created for people.
Wow. I pick up what you said in the first example about Mongolia, about what you said, that situation and that conversation made you feel embarrassed, that you realize it's obvious, you believe and you saw there's a lot of good benefit from the mine, but the mine, of course, was quick to turn on its electricity, and
Yeah.
here it went over top of this hospital that didn't. And it was that moment. I mean, if you're telling this story, I don't know how many years later, it's because that moment of embarrassment was profound.
Yeah.
I've designed a number of training programs where I take professionals from other disciplines, the supply chain manager, the project manager, the general manager, into communities and have them engage with community members for a day.
Yeah.
And often there's moments where they feel embarrassed because they realize they didn't actually understand the reality of that community member, wherever this community is. It doesn't have to be a far off country, but
Yeah.
whatever it is almost guaranteed. But I believe in it because I know that person get the mine manager out of their day to day into really just the community, talk to the farmer or the small business owner or whoever it is, guaranteed there's an aha moment where
Yeah.
they realize they had no idea. I mean, the mine manager in this example, what the community member's perspective and day to day was like. And
Yeah.
as much as I could have them in an hour session with a PowerPoint about what is social performance and why social risk and, why all these frameworks are important to your business strategy, I will forever change their perspective in that one moment of embarrassment.
I think there's sort of huge value. People, speak in different languages. Engineers speak a language all their own, and they've got a way of thinking about things. And people in corporate world sort of learn and listen through PowerPoint. But nothing beats sort of having people stand up to people they don't know, standing alongside people they don't know, and just having a chat, having a conversation about what works, what doesn't. So I think that's really powerful. That's really important. One of the other things I suppose I learned was the head of communities in Panama was a guy who was, before he was appointed head of communities, he was a project manager. So he was this sort of 6 foot tall, big, burly guy, Alberto Casas, whose whole life had been engineering, project management, getting stuff done on time, on budget. And he was put in the role of community, and he was in every community all the time, very much hands-on type of person. And he was one of the most powerful advocates I've seen in the rooms that, in the executives of the business with the engineers who typically make a lot of the decisions because that's how historically decisions were made. Here's a guy who speaks engineerese, who's also spent time with the local communities and is very courageous about calling out rubbish and saying what he felt and what the community felt. It was the role reversal where you had the hard nosed engineer acting on behalf of the communities. And it was really powerful because the guy, the mine manager and the project manager and those guys, they listened to him. So being able to have a voice that's listened to outside, once you move away from those community conversations, super important too.
Actually, as a plug for one of my podcast episodes in Spanish, I have an episode called El Bilingüismo, the bilingualism between social and business language. And I like how you said the engineerese, because one is to be able to have this lens that you can understand this community perspective. And then to our earlier conversation, have not just the curiosity, but the frameworks and rigor into understanding. But being able then to speak engineerese and to integrate that into decisions,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
is the real key to the puzzle.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things, if I sort of look back on the last 15, 20 years in mining, the capacity of folks in the community social performance space to have a seat at the table that's listened to is really growing. And I think that's a good thing, because certainly when I started, it was just seen as the soft end of, we just got to placate people, keep people happy, go away, throw them some money. And it's just a disastrous way of looking at things. And I think what's one of the positive signs of growth for the industry is that social performance, sustainability, to a less, government relations, etc. The folks in those roles have gotten much better at being heard in the rooms where it happens.
And that's a great segue, actually, because you started to say this is where the industry is going. And what are some emerging issues that the industry should be paying more attention to?
Oh, I think the industry is heading into a very challenging period. And I think there's sort of a couple of factors at play. So I think climate change, it's happening more quickly than a lot of folks expect. And it's going to require that more mines be built more quickly around the world at a pace that we haven't been able to do in the past 50 years. So the very real impacts of climate change is going to drive a pressure to build new mines and get more resources faster. I think the second big factor at play is what I call sort of national security and the competition between China and the US to control critical mineral supply chains, and the understanding of the US government in the past sort of 5 or 6 years that China has got a real stranglehold over this, and that the US, if they want to compete for the industries of tomorrow, which include defense industries, then they need vastly more minerals out of the ground and quickly. And the US need to have some type of control over those supply chains. And those two big sort of macro factors will drive the demand for mining to happen even faster. And there'll be less tolerance to take the time it requires to build community relationships, government relationships, do the things the way that have been done recently. And, there's reasons why it takes oftentimes 10, 15 years for a mine to go from finding the resource under the ground to sort of first ore, or 20 years. These things take time, but the way the world is moving at the macro level is putting pressure on that time. And it's going to get, I think over the next 5 years in particular, there's going to be a very high pressure to build mines much more quickly than we're accustomed to do it. And those forces at play, less so climate change, but particularly the national security angle, they'll have less tolerance for a pushback that says these things are going to take time. And the front line of that will be the folk dealing with communities who are looking at huge changes to their ways of life and their lands. It'll be the folks who deal with the governments who make the decisions about these things. But for the first time, you'll have the big governments of the world seeing their future dependent on these things, and they will be forces to be reckoned with. The demand for minerals, and particularly critical minerals, including copper, over the next 20 years is going to be a very, very tricky space, and there'll be huge pressure applied in countries and communities where those resources exist. And I remember talking with a very senior advisor in the Biden administration, and I was talking about the economic importance of, I think it was copper or something, it was mining. And he said, Todd, you don't understand. Mining to us now is much bigger than the economics of mining. It's a fight over who controls tomorrow, whether it's the USA or China. And that was another one of these light bulb moments was like, oh, we're going to have forces at play here that have no experience in this, but also have very little experience in hearing people say, hold on or wait a little while we solve a problem.
And that is, my hair's just stood up on my arms on that. But to our earlier conversation, that there are still companies who deny even needing to think about the socio-political context. Because all we need to do is have our images of the geology to get investment.
Right.
How far behind they are and how many eggs they're going to need to unscramble themselves even before you get to the next stage on that chain of investment and operators. It's mind-boggling. Before we close off, though, I always close out my sessions with the same question. What advice do you have to others to have success in this field, in this line of work?
So I think the primary thing for me is probably two things. One, be intellectually curious in whichever circumstance you find yourself in mining. There's so many forces at play affecting the decisions and the pathways here. Really open oneself to understand how multiple groups think about these things and understand the ecosystem of influence. Be curious and humble. And the second one is early on in your career, if you've got an opportunity, go to a site, like live there, live through the development of a mine site or for a couple of years. Go to Papua New Guinea, go to Mongolia, go to Peru, wherever. So nothing really beats having to live with the folks and live with the consequences of the decisions that are made that affect, the communities in which the mines operate. I think nothing beats sort of a bit of practical on-the-ground experience. And I came to this from having a few fancy degrees and thinking I was really good at understanding the world. But nothing beats jumping off from a helicopter in western province of Papua New Guinea, where the local communities will shoot bows and arrows at you because they're angry about what happened 10 years ago. That really sort of focuses the mind. And you realize that the best analysis, the book analysis or learning in the world is not enough. And the best time to do that stuff is when you're young.
I love that. I actually give very similar advice. I gave some today, actually. I've been engaging with students. I had an internship program, and I'm meeting with students who did not actually get the job, just giving them career advice. And there was this young Peruvian woman who currently is living in Greece. She fell in love with a Greek guy and doing consulting remotely in Greece. Anyways, and we were having this conversation. She's a little frustrated where her career is going, but I said, look, you're doing the part of your career that I can't teach you. I can't teach you the frustration and humility and maturity of not being able to read the menu.
Yeah.
And what you're learning on the other end of that. So trust that you're in the right place for your life right now, because I saw her curriculum. She'll propel ahead. She'll figure it out. And when she is sitting in that comfortable office, she will remember that experience of being in such a different environment and having to come out to that other side. So I think that's stellar advice. Well, listen, I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, Todd. I've learned a lot about you and very grateful that you joined the podcast.
No, my pleasure. Good to chat with you. And thanks for having me. It's great.
Thank you for joining us. If you like what you heard, please like, provide a 5-star review, and amplify.